710 KURV, Talkback, Dr Gelman, home of the iron microphone. We do not preach to the choir, but we teach the choir how to sing. And what we mean by that is that we prepare the listener to combat the ridiculous arguments of the statists that try to convince us that government is benevolent and good, and that we should allow our lives to be determined by what some politician or bureaucrat dictates. But what so often happens on those who are on our side, which is the side of individual liberty, freedom, and independence, is that when they confront those on the other side who believe in government control, that it gets down to a battle of emotions and opinions without fact. And so we try to educate the individual conservative as to what needs to be said in order to refute the arguments of the other side, not so much in order to sway their opinion, which of course is almost impossible to do, but to educate and inform the spectator as to what's going on. Now, yesterday, and this is a perfect example, yesterday I was watching the Judge Napolitano show, and I like him in general, and he had on this John Sununu, who's one of those statist establishment Republicans that calls themselves conservative because they are not overt communists. And there was the discussion about Romney, and Sununu is a big supporter of Romney, no surprise there, since he was a big part of the George Bush statist fascist organization when George Bush was president. And the John Sununu was refuting or attempted to refute Napolitano's view that Romney is not a true conservative by saying that when Romney was governor of Massachusetts around the year 2002, 2003 for one term, that he reduced the size of government and got everything in order and cut the budget and this and that and so on and so forth, and went in with a budget deficit and then left with a budget surplus. Apparently Napolitano made the cardinal mistake, cardinal sin, of asking a question without already knowing the answer, and he was unable or did not refute Sununu's assertions. But I, knowing intrinsically and innately that there's no way that Romney came out of Massachusetts with a true reduction in government, being the statist that he is, being the warmonger that he is, being the that he created a national style healthcare service in Massachusetts and is proud about that Romney care. The fact of the matter is that when Romney was governor of Massachusetts, the state budget went up about 20% or so, from $28 billion to $33 billion. So he did not cut the deficit. He did not cut the size of the government. The reason he did not cut the budget. The reason that the deficit went down for the state is there's a number of reasons. One, even though he did not make an overt tax increase, he did increase fees to everybody for automobile licenses, for filing for licenses for business, fees for doing business in the state, whether it was opening a business or whether it was closing a business or expanding a business, all kinds of fees that were added on for licensing of the state, which added hundreds of millions of dollars to the coffers. Another thing that Romney did was that the state government, like the federal government in its dispensation of funds to the states, the state government had a dispensation to the budgets of the municipalities of Massachusetts. He eliminated or reduced those, but what that meant was that the individual municipality had to increase their tax base somehow, and so even though the state did not increase the taxes directly upon the citizens, state actions indirectly forced increased taxes on the citizens, but through the municipalities. So Romney did not actually improve the economy of Massachusetts at all. There was all other things which are independent from Romney, which was the general robustness of the economy in the United States, though Massachusetts did lag behind many other states in job increases and revenue increases. And so Judge Napolitano did not have the necessary information at hand, had not bothered to do an investigation prior to making the assertion, and allowed Sununu to come off and defeat Napolitano in front of millions of viewers. It was the responsibility of the moderator, of Judge Napolitano, to have his information at hand. If he had the information at hand, which takes no more than 5 minutes to look under, then he would be able to refute every assertion that Sununu had and turn a loss into a victory. And that is the problem that too many often have in confronting the statists, is that we allow them to get away with their assertions without fact-finding, without vetting, and then they go from one topic to another, and it allows the blustering individuals such as Sununu to come off as if the Judge Napolitano or whomever else is there was incorrect. And of course, once you're shown to be incorrect in something, then it is easy to extrapolate that you're incorrect in everything, and so therefore everything that the conservative commentator says subsequent to that is going to have a pall cast upon it, because once the perception is that you were wrong on one thing, it becomes easy to think that you're wrong on almost everything else that you say. And since most of the listeners don't have the gumption or the intention of actually fact-checking anything, they just assume what is being told to them through the media by figures of notoriety or authority. They just assume that to be accurate and correct, which, of course, we know from this program is simply not true, that most of what you hear through the media is simply lies propagated by the government in order to meet a government agenda. So the another thing that happened the other day, day before, was that Barack Obama, while the Congress was in session, while the Senate was in session, at least technically, made appointments to the executive branch that normally require Senate confirmation. Since the Senate refused to confirm the individuals that Barack Obama wanted to have on the National Labor Relations Boards and some other financial board, that he just went ahead and did it on his own without the congressional approval. Now, I understand that for cabinet posts and Secretary of State and things like that, who are answerable to the president and whose consult is to the president and really they cannot extend their consult to the national level because they are consultants to the president. The National Labor Relations Board and this other financial board, they independently of the president can set policy, dictate policy, as the National Labor Relations Boards did with the Boeing attempt to open a plant in South Carolina, which the National Labor Relations Board stopped. That was without Barack Obama's direct approval. And so when it comes to those agencies of the government that have a direct effect upon what goes on in the states and with the citizens, then clearly it is very important that those individuals do be approved by the Senate. Now, the Senate, typical Senate and Congress in its lackluster form, whined about the impropriety of what Barack Obama had done, and that was about it. So Barack Obama has contempt for the Congress, and I think it is justifiable contempt because we do have a contemptible Congress as well as a contemptible president. And the thing is that the Congress goes about wringing its hand and moaning and groaning and wailing and gnashing of teeth. However, the Congress does have the power to do something about it, but they refuse to do that because they are gutless wonders they are all a bunch of George Bush statists who don't have any principles whatsoever and moan and groan and whine but don't do anything even though it is in their power to do so. In this particular case, it's very simple. The Congress can defund at a minimum, not pay the salaries of those individuals on the board, National Labor Relations Board. Now, of course, they can go ahead and function without salary if they wish to volunteer for those positions, but the Congress can actually defund the entire National Labor Relations Board. In fact, the Congress can defund the entire executive branch if it so chooses to do so. So it is well within the power, but Barack Obama has measured his opponent and found them wanting, and he knows that the feckless, useless, cowardly, gutless Congress that we have, even though it has a House run by the opposition party, the Republicans, and a significant minority in the Senate, that there isn't enough gumption and a whole group of them put together to fill a thimble. And so there you have it. But if I was the Speaker of the House, I would immediately defund the entire executive branch. I want to talk a little bit about the Ron Paul situation in Iowa. I was a bit disappointed. I'm a supporter of Ron Paul, and I was a bit disappointed that he was a third-place finish when I fully expected him to be a first-place finish, even though for all intents and purposes, there was a three-way tie for first place, though none achieved more than 25% of the vote. But so much of what goes on in politics is perception. And then there was the unexpected rise of a Rick Santorum. I found it very interesting how the media works things. The non-existent Ron Santorum campaign, which the media proclaimed often, all of a sudden, as the media decided to make a hero out of Santorum, all of a sudden his non-existent campaign, the wording was changed to his low-key but effective campaign. What a bunch of nonsense. I'll tell you exactly what happened over there, and you're not going to hear this anywhere because no one thinks before they speak. And this is what I believe happened in Iowa, how Santorum got to be where he is and what happened to Ron Paul. And to me, I have to say that I was much chagrined in the conservative pundits being attacking Ron Paul. And I am washing my hands of Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, and Mark Stein. I wash my hands of them. Do we have a washing the hands soundtrack? No? How about a toilet? All right, let's hear that. Okay, so this is what I think about Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, and Mark Stein. You know, they all present themselves as Reagan Republicans, but we must remember that none of them were around during the Reagan campaigns for president in 76 and 80, except maybe Mark Levin as a very young man. And they all attacked Ron Paul. Now, I found it very interesting, and it makes me kind of wonder. How is it? Because rarely, if ever, does Rush Limbaugh, and he makes a big point about it, he doesn't go and promote anyone. He does it usually attack the president, whether it's Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. But when it comes to endorsing a nominee, we say once someone is in office, he doesn't mind attacking or promoting. But when they're nominees and they're running for an office, he avoids making a recommendation. But in this case, he made no bones about his opposition to Ron Paul, and he also followed suit with Sean Hannity and most of the other, and Mark Levin and Mark Stein. And I wash my hands of all of them. So this is what I think happened. You have the Iowa voter, the conservative, the Tea Party conservative, that was going to vote for Ron Paul, but they also listened to the conservative pundits, whether it's those already mentioned. And so they're there and says, oh my gosh, I've been listening to Mark Levin, I've been listening to Rush Limbaugh, and I support them, and I'm with them, and they're all attacking Ron Paul. So even though I like Ron Paul, this is the voter thinking to himself, I mean, these experts are telling me otherwise, so I'm going to take their word. I'm going to take their word for it, and I'm not going to vote for Ron Paul, so who do I vote for? So what happens is they don't want to vote for Romney because they know Romney to be the statist Barackian that he is, and so they are left. They are left to vote for whom? Another Barackian, which is Newt Gingrich or someone like that, or the unknown. Okay, so as in the last election, none of the above won. The last election, where twice as many people did not vote as voted for the winner, eventual winner, which was Barack Obama. They went for none of the above, and none of the above in this case was Rick Santorum. And now, of course, perception becoming reality. Now the perception is, that the people really wanted Rick Santorum, and that's not true. They didn't want him at all. They wanted Ron Paul, but they were misled by the so-called conservative pundits, and therefore went for the none of the above candidate, which was Rick Santorum. Now, of course, the perception is, all these people, he really is an up-and-coming rising star, and he really is the new hope on the horizon. So it may carry on from there, but in the Iowa election, what I think happened was that the betrayal of conservative principles by pundits is the reason that Ron Paul didn't do as well as expected. Ron Paul is continuously being attacked by those conservative commentators based primarily on his foreign policy views, which they perceive as naive and weak on Iran. They neglect the fact that Ron Paul's predictions on the housing bubble, on the devaluation of the currency, on illegal wars, on the imperial government, on the growth of government and the Federal Reserve, and all of those predictions that he had, which turned out to be true on the domestic front, they ignore that, even though he was one of the few that predicted that accurately. They ignore all that, and they harp about his foreign policy views. Now, one must wonder. You would think that before you made such pronouncements, that you would take pause. In that, if Ron Paul was so prescient in his predictions on the economy, that maybe he may be ahead of the game on foreign policy as well. But why don't we just take a look at American foreign policy and its success? Now, we'll just look at the 20th century, for example. In World War I, the United States intervened in World War I because the fascist Woodrow Wilson wanted to get the United States in the war, to put the United States and Woodrow Wilson astride the world. In that the United States, in its imperialist desires, or at least Woodrow Wilson's imperialist desires and Franklin Roosevelt's imperialist desires, and you may ask, what's Franklin Roosevelt got to do with it? Well, the fact of the matter is, it was Franklin Roosevelt that actually did the tactics that got the United States in World War I. It was the assistant secretary of the Navy's tactics, and that was Franklin Roosevelt, who lured the Germans into attacking merchant ships in the Atlantic, because what Franklin Roosevelt did is that he made it known that these merchant ships were carrying munitions and armaments to the enemies of the Germans. And even though the Germans warned the United States that this was actually a non-neutral act, that it was an act of war, by supplying with munitions the enemies of Germany, the United States, what hoped and what came to pass is that the Germans would have to retaliate in order for their own self-defense, and then the United States propaganda mills made it appear that these were unprovoked attack against civilian shippings by these brutal Germans, when the fact of the matter is it was the United States that did it intentionally in order to create the reason to declare war on Germany for the imperialist designs of Woodrow Wilson. Unfortunately for Wilson, fortunately for the United States, once the war was over and a League of Nations was created, the predecessor to the United Nations, the United States Congress refused to allow the United States to enter the League of Nations because we did not want to be involved in the internal affairs of Europe, the mess that the internal affairs of Europe would be. Clearly, we had a Congress much more intelligent in 1918 than in 1945 when we did join the United Nations. What the League of Nations then proceeded to do was treat the world as a jigsaw puzzle. These are the typical bureaucrats, aristocrats of Europe who think that they know better and that they have the right to determine the lives of other peoples, and they do so because they were born superior. The typical eugenics belief that so many politicians adhere to, which says that they were born smarter than anybody else and it was their right, duty, and obligation to control the lives of other people. So they proceeded to look at the world as a jigsaw puzzle and created countries out of nowhere, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, created out of nothing, out of the breakup of the Habsburg Empire, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And so they put Germans into a country called Czechoslovakia, and they put Serbians and Croatians together in a country called Yugoslavia. They created nations out of whole cloth, such as Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, which had never existed before, and based on the whims of this group of bureaucrats. And of course, we all know the results of those machinations. It resulted directly in World War II. That and the draconian rules that were placed upon the Germans, which guaranteed that their economy could not survive, and therefore allowed for the upheaval in that country, which resulted in Adolf Hitler taking control of the country and directly resulted in World War II. American foreign policy in World War II, we entered the war in order to save Stalin from the Germans. We entered the war in 1941, which was in December of 1941, a full year and a half after Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium, and other countries had already fallen to the Nazi war machine, and in which England was at war for at least a year and a half before the United States entered the war. The reason the United States entered the war in December of 1941 rather than in May of 1940 was because the reason to enter the war in December of 1941 did not exist in 1940. Because in 1940, Stalin and Hitler were allies, and they were allies in the dismemberment of Poland, among other things. However, by December of 1941, Hitler and Stalin had a falling out, and Stalin was on the verge of being, and Russia was on the verge of being annihilated. The United States entered the war by doing exactly what they did in World War I under Franklin Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Going to a break, 7 at KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of our microphone. Be back after this short break. Seventh and KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, back talking to our friends in the audience, the scientific conservatives that we have that listen to this program. And so we had Franklin Roosevelt who lured Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor by doing exactly the same thing that Franklin Roosevelt did in World War I, by doing acts of war against another country and concealing those acts from the American people. Then when the nations that had been aggrieved by the United States retaliated, the government made it appear through their propaganda mills that the United States had been just minding its own business, just fiddling its thumbs. But what happened was, and for no reason whatsoever, we were attacked by these ruthless and barbaric enemies. The fact of the matter is, the United States put an oil and steel embargo upon Japan, tried to strangle it. The United States tried to impose its foreign policy will upon Japan, and Japan refused to go along, much as any other country would refuse to go along when they were going to be bullied by another nation. And so Japan retaliated against the incursion by the United States, which was illegal, into the southeastern into the Pacific, and which was really the area of influence of Japan. But what would the United States have thought, and what did we think? What did we do when Russia put missiles in Cuba? Imagine what the United States would have done if the Japanese had sent its Navy into the Caribbean. Well, that's exactly what the United States did to Japan when it sent its Navy into the Pacific. So Japan retaliated as could have been expected, and which actually Franklin Roosevelt incentivized and hoped for in order to get into the war to save Stalin. Further proof of Franklin Roosevelt's being in agreement with Stalin in his statist views is when the Second War ended. The United States handed over all of Eastern Europe to the Soviets and handed over the entire country of China to the Maoist communist statists, and also North Korea, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asian countries handed over to the statist communists by Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and the United States. So our so-called great foreign policy, our so-called just wars of World War I and World War II were really nothing of the sort. They were actually nothing but, other than imperialism. It was Franklin Roosevelt's and Woodrow Wilson's statism, in which they allied themselves with other statists at the time. Woodrow Wilson was a firm believer in eugenics, in that there were some people that were just simply born superior to others, and it was their right and obligation to take care of or impose their will upon all other peoples. And so now we have a situation in the Middle East. And what has been the result of our imposition of the United States on the Middle East? We took a backwater area that was essentially of no importance, and we have created the monster that exists there today. We have funded the Muslim Brotherhood. We have funded Iran. We have funded Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Fatah. We have funded them directly and indirectly through our oil purchases from the great terrorist sponsor, Saudi Arabia. American foreign policy has essentially guaranteed that the entire Middle East will be dominated by fundamentalist, barbaric Islamists. We have put into power the Islamists of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Turkey, and any other, Yemen, Tunisia, Algeria. The United States has, in one way or another, not only created those barbaric regimes of Sharia law. Under Sharia law, we have also armed and trained their military and all these paramilitary outfits such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Fatah. That's the United States that has done that. This canard, this nonsense that goes on, that we are there to help Israel and to protect oil, protect our oil, is a bunch of nonsense. First, the only reason the United States supports Israel at all, ostensibly, is because of the Jewish bloc in the United States. It gives the United States the reason, the justification for the multiple times of support that they give Arab nations. If you add up the total number of dollars given to the Arab nations that surround Israel compared to Israel, what is given to Israel, that what the Arabs get is hundreds of times more money than what the Israelis get. Furthermore, by the pretense of being pro-Israel and being a supporter of Israel, it allows the United States government to impose its will upon the Israelis, and that imposition of United States policy on Israel is what puts Israel in such a precarious position, because it is the United States that forces Israel to continually give up territory to prevent them from defending themselves, and to and weakens Israel continuously. So the United States is pro-Arab, pro-Muslim, pro-Islamist. Why? Because the United States government is statist. The United States, Barack Obama, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and all the rest are statists who believe that the select group of individuals ought to determine the lives of everybody else. And if there's a government system like that in the world, it is communism, it is fascism, and it is Islam. Islamist countries impose the will of a few upon the rest of the people. They are intolerant to other viewpoints. They are intolerant to other peoples. Islam is a perfect statist outfit. They are exactly the same as Nazism or communism in their view of world domination, in intolerance to other systems, in brutality towards their own people. And that is why Barack Obama likes them. That is why George Bush liked them, because they are kindred spirits. The sheiks of Arabia and Barack Obama and George Bush, they are kindred spirits, as the aristocrats of Europe were kindred spirits one to the other. All statists are the same. All politicians, or most politicians, are the same. And so Ron Paul says the United States Constitution prohibits the United States intervention into outside our borders. And the response to him is, you are naive. You don't understand the dangers of a nuclear Iran. You don't understand the threat to our oil if we abandon the Middle East. But what we went to war in the Middle East in order to save Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. If Saddam Hussein had taken Kuwait, would that have cut off our oil supply? Wouldn't actually the situation be a lot more stable today if Saddam Hussein had taken Kuwait and subsequently taken Saudi Arabia? If Saddam Hussein had taken away Saudi Arabia and knocked off the Saud family, the oil would be much less expensive today, and the biggest funder of terrorism, which is the Saud family of Saudi Arabia, which is nothing but a bunch of tyrant desert dwellers that took over that country by force and named it after themselves. They, bunch of barbarians living in the 10th century, they are the biggest funders of terrorism in the world, the biggest funders of the most intolerant form of Islam, Wahhabism. So we have, and that the United States protected them from Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was our friend. Saddam Hussein was the balance to Iran. What balance is there to Iran now? Now let's take a look at a nuclearized Iran. Are they any more insane than in Pakistan? I dare say that the Pakistanis are more insane than the Iranian government. And yet no one is saying we ought to be taking out Pakistan. What about China? Do you think they're more rational than Iran? What about all the other nuclear powers in the world that are completely run by irrational statists? Or are we at more danger from Iran than from Pakistan, than from China, than from Russia? I don't think so. So, okay, if that's what they want, well then fine, but I don't see. Ron Paul says it's not for us to intervene into that situation. It's not for us to dictate to other nations. Then he's right, and and that also goes for Israel as well. If it wasn't for the United States intervention in the Middle East, there would be no issues in the Middle East. The situation would resolve on its own. But When you are rewarded for terrorism, as the United States rewards terrorist countries, what terrorist countries does the United States reward? Well, it rewards Saudi Arabia with giving them all this money for their oil. What do they do with their money? They fund terrorism. We have armed, trained, and supported and benefited Hezbollah, Al-Fatah, and Hamas organizations which probably would not exist if it wasn't for the United States supporting them. And more importantly, if it wasn't for the United States creating an environment in those countries which allows those terrorist regimes to become in charge of the control of the countries in which they brutalize. So Ron Paul has been correct on everything that he has said, and he is correct and prophetic on what's going on as far as our foreign policy. So then the question arises, what is the reality of a Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and all the rest? And one has to now think that possibly they are not what they make themselves out to be. Because let me ask you this, what is more dangerous, the overt enemy or the traitor in your midst? Well, of course, the traitor in your midst is the overt enemy because the overt enemy is identified, and therefore you know where that enemy stands and you can defend yourself against it. But a traitor is someone who pretends to be on your side, and therefore you let your guard down and you may allow them to sway your opinions to do things which by the facade of their being your friend, it makes them seem like they are on your side, when in reality they are on the opposite side. They are, of course, the enemy, but you lower your defenses. So when you have all these individuals, such as Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Mark Levin, basically undercut and possibly even destroy the campaign of the true conservative libertarian that is Ron Paul, the true constitutionalist, then we may wonder on what side are these other people? Is Rush Limbaugh actually a mole that has pretended to be a conservative, just waiting for the time when another Reagan would rise in order to undermine that individual so that no new Reagan would appear? Because remember, Rush Limbaugh and all the rest didn't come on the scene till after Reagan was elected as president. Who knows what they would have done if they had been around when Reagan was running for the president. And so we know that the Republican establishment hated Ronald Reagan. They laughed at Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan did it essentially on his own, became president, and was beloved by the American people because Ronald Reagan was an American in heart and soul and spirit, whereas George Bush is a statist in heart and soul and spirit, much more akin to Stalin and Hitler than to Ronald Reagan. And so therefore, if you are a statist, and you never want to see another Ronald Reagan come along, then what you do is you create this mechanism of propagandizing and indoctrination, make people believe that you are a conservative, a true libertarian conservative, and then you wait, making the world and the United States listener think that you are a true conservative. And then when a true conservative does arise, you attack him. And then by having gained the confidence of the American people in your viewpoint, and then you attack the conservative and say, oh my gosh, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Mark Steyn, and Mark Levin, who have been true blue libertarian conservatives and that I have been listening to for 5, 10, and 20 years, and now they're saying Ron Paul is not good. Well, they must know. They know more than me. They're more into it than me. They're smarter than I am, and so therefore I will do as they say. So are they true conservative libertarians, or are they in actuality statists masquerading as conservatives, hiding in the open, so to speak, waiting for the next Reagan to come along specifically in order to undermine and undercut the candidacy of the one individual that will take us back to Reagan-esque policies. One must consider that, because the effective traitor, of course, is the one that comes across as the greatest patriot. That is how they fool you. That is how they make you think that they are on your side. And so they will go out of their way to make themselves appear to be great patriots so that you will be lulled into a sense of false security. And then when the time comes, they surreptitiously make sure that the true libertarian gets undermined. And to me, I think that we ought to consider that very real possibility that all of these individuals have been statists in libertarian clothing and are really not true libertarians, true constitutionalists. 710 KURV Talkback with Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, streaming live at KURV.com. Be back after the short commercial break. .710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. We're back. So it is important, I think, that we are aware who it is we're getting information from. I, of course, have no ulterior motivation. I don't earn a living from this. I don't need sponsors and commercial. I don't sell myself to anyone as these other commentators and moderators do. I do research as to what before I say something. I try to be as honest and forthright as possible. I, too, am disappointed so often in individuals that you have faith and trust in and they let you down. So, but with an understanding of history and seeing how the parallels of things that have happened before to what's going on now, and therefore how you can predict what will result from those from the actions being taken. You can predict where things are going down the road, but unfortunately, most people don't accept predictions. They kind of got to be in the middle of something before they recognize it. It's hard for most to go out on a limb, to take a risk, to have a point of view that hasn't been, which is individually created on their own, based upon their own investigation and their own conclusions, coming through it to a certain logic. It is much easier to regurgitate what figures of notoriety or authority state through the media, through the system of public education. They tell you things, you repeat them. If you're a Democrat, whatever a Democrat says, you accept it as true and you repeat it without understanding the basis. If you're a Republican, you accept what they say as being true and you repeat it. You come to believe it without checking to see if it's going to be, if it's not true, and then you come to these false conclusions that it's better to have an unprincipled Republican in office than a Democrat if you're a Republican. And it's better to have an unprincipled Democrat in office versus a Republican if you're a Democrat. And that is not what this country is all about. That is not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be a constitutional government, a government based upon the ideology of our founding fathers. We have strayed very far afield from that path, and because the Constitution, as I've stated many times in this program and proved it on this program, has been completely undercut and undermined by our politicians. Politicians seek to gain power. That is what they wish to do. That is what their character is. That is innate to being a politician. Politicians are politicians because they want to control the lives of other people. And so the Constitution was to protect the people, so the Constitution was destroyed by our own political class. This is 710 KURV Talkback. Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. Be back after the short commercial break. 710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, home of scientific conservatism, where we teach the choir how to sing. We bandy about words and oftentimes don't even understand what they mean. It's just something that we hear all the time. We really don't give it much of a thought. And we think, and therefore we think we know what they mean, but when asked to define or explain the terminology, oftentimes we are caught short. Freedom. What is freedom? I mean, if you were to ask most people what freedom is, what would they tell you? Many would say it is the ability to do whatever you want. Is that freedom? That's only freedom if you are the only person that's only accurate if you're the only person in the world. Because if I can do whatever I want, and let's say I have a neighbor and I want his car and I steal his car, well, what about the freedom of my neighbor? What has happened to his or her freedom if I'm able to intrude and impinge on him? I've reduced that person's freedom. So freedom is not to be able to do whatever you want. Freedom is the right to regulate your own life. Slavery is when someone else regulates your life. So freedom is not to the ability to do whatever you want. It is the ability to regulate your own life. That's very important, because regulating your own life means that you have to make decisions and you have to be responsible for the decisions that you make. And you have to understand that in the context of functioning in a society. Because if you do something which affects negatively the freedom of others in society, you will or possibly be penalized. And therefore some of your freedoms will be restricted. If you are free, you think, to steal from someone else, society will impose a punishment upon you to restrict your freedom so that you can't do that again. So freedom is the ability to regulate your own life, but regulate it you must. Otherwise, you may lose some of your freedoms. In our society, freedom seems to be where you are free to demand food stamps, where you are free to demand free education, free health care, free food. And so that's not freedom, okay? That is something other. Now, let's look at the word right. What is a right? Well, there's a lot of similarities with freedom. Now, freedom, as I said, is the ability to regulate your own life. Now, a right is something that's conferred into individuals naturally, something you are born with. Okay, so you have a right to life. That means no one has the prerogative to take away your life without due process. And so your right. Once again, you have to configure that into a society, into a social mechanism. You have a right to life. You have a right to self-defense. Why? Because to preserve your right to life, you have a right to defend that. And so your rights are all based upon the right to your life and everything you can do to preserve that. Now, you might say, well, let's take a look at food stamps. Food stamps, I have a right to life, true, cannot be taken without due process, and I have and with this right to life, I cannot live without food. So then, therefore, don't I have the right to take food if I'm unable to pay for it or if I'm unable to grow it on my own? Well, because didn't you just say that I have a right to life, and without food I cannot have life? That would be the simple-minded viewpoint, the political viewpoint, your university viewpoint. However, you have to think about where you're getting the food from. If you go out there in free land and there's an apple tree and you grab an apple from the tree that nobody owns, then okay. But can you walk into a grocery store and take food without paying for it, even though you have a right to life? Well, no, you can't, because just as you have rights, so does the grocer have rights. The grocer, through his efforts, has created this store in which he puts energy into the store and funds and energy, and therefore, when you take from that individual without his consent, his or her consent, or without paying for it, what about that individual's rights? What about the rights of the grocer? You have impinged upon his rights. So when you're thinking about freedom and rights, you cannot think about that in a vacuum. You must think about that in the relation with other people in a society. And only in that way can you understand what freedom is, what a freedom is, and what rights are. But these kinds of discussions never seem to appear in the media, because it is not what the government wants you to know. There is no right to health care, because health care needs to be provided by someone, whether it is through technology or through personal effort. As a physician, if no one has the right to force me to take care of them or to pay for their health care, because then what about my rights? There is no right to public education, because if I'm forced to pay for someone else's education, what about my rights? If I'm a farmer growing food through the sweat of my brow and my expenditures and energy and funds and growing food, no one has the right to come onto my property and take food from my farm without my permission, because what about my rights? So there is no right to food stamps, because someone has to provide it. There is no right to health care, because someone has to provide it. There is no right to housing or to anything else that someone else has to provide, because what about their rights? But in this society, we have corrupted the meanings of freedoms and rights to make it appear that it is my right to take from you to give to me, because we say so. Now, what the government does through its propaganda mills is it makes those who are forced to give up what they have earned, that to others that have not earned it, that they are somehow, those individuals who are opposed to that, there's something wrong with them, that they are heartless, that they are cruel, because because they have enough food, but they don't want to give food to someone else, because they have a nice house, but they don't want to provide housing for someone else, because they can pay for their education, but they don't want to pay for someone else's education, and therefore you're cruel. You're cruel and merciless and not fair. It's not fair that you refuse to give up what you have, that you have earned, to someone else who has less. And because you refuse to do so, we, the government, will do it for you coercively. And all the government expects to get is votes, so they can stay in office. And do you really believe that your average politician has the interests of society at heart? Do you really believe that the average politician is really in it for the good of the nation? Or is it more likely, as with all politicians in the world, that they're in it for themselves, for their own power, for their own self-aggrandizement? Let's take a look at Medicare and Medicaid. Why do Medicare and Medicaid exist? Some people say they're to guarantee health care for the elderly or the poor, when in reality, Medicare and Medicaid exist for no other reason than to increase the power of government and to allow the politicians and bureaucrats in government to divert funds from the American producer to worthless entities that happen to be friends, relatives, contributors and cronies of politicians and bureaucrats. And so the government does not allow the individual to decide their own fate or how their healthcare dollars should be spent or how their education dollars should be spent. No, the government confiscates your wealth, what you have earned, specifically to increase the power of government and politicians and to take your money and spend it where you would not spend it if you were given the opportunity to decide where your money should go. The government's going to decide where the money goes, and where it goes is to the friends and relatives and contributors and cronies of politicians. The bailout of the banks and the mortgage houses and the investment firms made no sense if looked upon in a strictly economic viewpoint. Because why would you resuscitate those institutions, those financial institutions that had proven themselves to be so grossly incompetent is that they went bankrupt? Why would you reinfuse funds to entities that had proven themselves incapable of properly managing those funds, unless the owners and executives of those banks, mortgage houses, and financial firms were somehow tied and connected to politicians? Then it makes sense. And that is all the TARP program was. That is all the stimulus program is to funnel money to those who are friends, relatives, contributors, and cronies of politicians. And the reason the Republicans want to be in power or the Democrats want to be in power is not to guarantee constitutional principles upon the nation and to guarantee the rights of the individual. No, it is not that at all. Your average Republican and Democrat want to be in power because then they will determine the flow of money. So then if the Republicans are in power, it is the friends, cronies, relatives of contributors to Republicans that get the money, and that is why the Republicans want to be in power. That is why the Democrats want to be in power, because then the Democrats can determine where the monies go. That's the only reason that they wish to be in power. It has nothing to do with imposing or guaranteeing constitutional principles upon the American people. The debate as it exists today in our society is completely nonsensical. They make it appear that you have two groups. You have the side which says we must reduce so-called entitlements because we are going bankrupt as a nation. And then you have the other side that says, no, we must maintain these entitlements and do whatever is possible, even if it means taking more money from the productive class, because we must protect the underprivileged in our society. And that is your debate, and it is a canard, and it is false, and it is a lie. Because in our society, with the economy that we have, the productivity of the United States, we can provide access to excellent health care, access to excellent education, access to an excellent society for every single member of our nation. But the reason that we don't do that has nothing to do with the lack of funds or lack of assets, but everything to do with the diversion of funds to the unnecessary, to the corrupt. That is all it is. Because we have more than enough money for health care, for example. The reason there is at times inadequate access is because so much of the money gets diverted to unnecessary providers. Those who provide durable medical equipment and nursing homes and all this other trash and nonsense that receives the bulk, not just a small amount, the bulk of healthcare dollars. They say it is perfectly legal, but what does legal mean? Legal means you want to do something that is unjust, but you want to do it and make it legal and allow you to do it, so you make a law that says what is unjust is actually legal. That is nothing new in our society or in any other society. You make legal what is unjust. Was not slavery legal at one time? Was it unjust? Of course. Was it legal? Yes. Abortion is legal. Is it unjust? Of course it's unjust. It deprives life without due process according to the Constitution. Yet it is legal. Does that make it just? Of course not. And so therefore, when you want to, the best way to allow the unjust to happen is to legalize it. And that is what they all do. Forced unionization is unjust. Why should someone have to belong to an organization and pay that organization money simply to be allowed to work? That is unjust, but it is legal. Why? Because the government made it legal, because it benefits those who contribute to government, the cronies of government. And so that is how we need to start looking at these things. Just because it's legal doesn't make it just. Now, of course, something unjust that is made legal has to be made appear to the people that there's a rationale for it. And so the rationale for Medicare and Medicaid is that it's there to help the poor and help the elderly. And so those who wish to revamp or eliminate that system are accused of being heartless and soulless and merciless. And that is how, but the fact of the matter is those programs exist not to provide health care or guarantee health care, but to enrich a certain gangster class in our society that works with and is part of our government. We need to start looking at things in that manner because that is the truth. But fortunately, when you have a system of publication which exists for no other purpose than to indoctrinate the American people and its children and make them believe that government is benevolent when we actually know the government is malevolent. But they indoctrinate us to make us believe the government is benevolent, that the government is looking out for our own good, when in fact the government is looking out only for its own good. The politicians go around saying they're working for us, when in fact they're working for themselves. But they have to lie in order to try to convince the American people that it is justified for the government to forcibly take your earnings from you to give it to those who do not earn, and that it is somehow good for the nation. Well, when you incentivize unemployment, you get more unemployment. When there are no negative repercussions to being uneducated, then more people are uneducated. And so you have Barack Obama, and people say that he's incompetent. He's incompetent because the economy, it continues to flounder, even though he has spent hundreds of billions of dollars to prop it up. But he is not incompetent. In fact, he is very competent. He has done exactly as he set out to do. Barack Obama took money from the productive American and gave it to the non-productive crook that supports Barack Obama. So Barack Obama took money from the good American and gave it to the bad individual who lives in this country in order to benefit Barack Obama. Barack Obama bailed out General Motors and Chrysler. Why? Because he took taxpayer dollars to benefit the United Auto Workers and the executive General Motors and Chrysler, who in turn then gave money to the Democrats and Barack Obama. Barack Obama saved Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and all these others incompetently managed organizations. He gave them money because he knew then they would give him money. So what did Barack Obama do? By destroying the economy and making it more difficult for the individual entrepreneur to survive, he reduced the effectiveness and the power of those opposed to Barack Obama. Those who believe in individual liberty, freedom, and independence, those who believe in the free market were hurt by Barack Obama's program. That is what he wanted, because those who believe in individual liberty, freedom, and independence, and those who believe in the free market are opposed to Barack Obama. So he weakened them through his regulatory process, through his taxation process, through his other draconian measures, which made it more difficult for the productive to be productive, which made it more difficult for the independent to remain independent. And then he took their money and he gave it to the non-producers, the parasites, the United Auto Workers, AFL-CIO and all the other unions, the municipal unions. He took money from the productive to give it to the parasites, to the school teachers, to the system of public education, to the indoctrinators, to the liars, to those who support big government. So Barack Obama's programs took money from the productive American and gave money to the parasite, who then gave that money back to Barack Obama so he could continue with his nefarious ways. There's a couple of reasons that these obvious actions are not being investigated or pronounced is because the Republicans, the so-called party in opposition, is actually in agreement with all those philosophies and therefore do not recognize it as being anti-constitutional, since they don't recognize the Constitution. The media is nothing but the propaganda arm of the government, and therefore going to regurgitate exactly what the government tells them to regurgitate. And the system of public education is there simply to indoctrinate the children, and so therefore it's not going to be made clear to them either. And so Barack Obama, though on the surface being incompetent, why is he so emboldened? Why does he appear more confident than ever? Why does he become more fearless than ever? Because what he wanted to achieve, he is achieving, and that is turning the country into a nation dependent of peoples in which a significant minority or maybe even a majority are dependent upon government, and that keeps government in power. If the unemployed are dependent upon government, the government wants more unemployed. If the uneducated are dependent upon government, then the government wants more uneducated. Do you think that our system of public education could be such a disaster, producing semi-literates or illiterates without a skill set that is then dependent upon the government dole forever, from generation to generation? Do you think that could happen by accident? Of course not. It is purposeful and intentional, and that is why it is national. That is why every school system, every system of public education in the United States is bad. That cannot happen by accident. If it was an accident, then there would be good and there would be bad, and it would be non-predictable. But it is predictable that every system of public education in the United States is bad. And it's bad because it is a national program to guarantee that it remain bad. Why is there no discussion of the Constitutional Declaration of Independence in our system of public education? Because those documents are easily understood and would take a half hour to read. Anyone reading those documents would come to the realization that the founding documents of the country, the founding principles of the country, are not the way we live now. And people might question that. They might say, wait a second, the Constitution says this, the Declaration says this, that is certainly not the way the country is functioning right now. Maybe this government is lying to us. Maybe this government is a parasite. Maybe this government is evil. Maybe this government needs to be eliminated. That is the last thing that our government and our politicians want people to think, and so they spend all their time creating this massive system of lies to the American people, much as in the book 1984, and we're going to discuss that after this short commercial break. 7 KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. We're back. 710 KRV, Talkback with Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. We're talking about the novel 1984, written by George Orwell in 1949. Certainly, it is a must-read for any conservative. George Orwell lived in a time and was aware of the Soviet Union. and the ideas that a utopian society could be created. But it turns out that a utopian society can only be imposed from the top down. When the government is in charge of a utopian society, because it has to be from the government, who defines what utopia is. In a novel 1984, there is living in a society, which at that time was in the future, of course, being written in 1949, in which the citizens were controlled completely by the government. There was a perpetual state of war. Most citizens lived in poverty. And there was a very sophisticated, omnipresent, never-ending indoctrination process going on, in which the individual was to owe all allegiance to a big brother, the father figure, the one who controlled your life and did what was best for you, protecting you against an unseen enemy, but nevertheless an enemy that exists, and he would protect you from that unseen enemy. In your homes, you were always being observed by cameras connected to big brothers so that all of your actions were observable. Everything that you received came directly from the government, and no matter the fact that your food was no good, your clothes were no good, you lived in a shabby apartment, since everybody else, except for a select few in the government, lived the same way, there was really nothing to complain about. And don't even try to complain, because then you disappear. Those who complained not only disappeared, they had their history eliminated as if they had never existed in the first place. In the book 1949, in the book 1984, Winston Smith is the protagonist. He is a member of the inner circle of the government, and not the most inner circle, but someone that worked directly with the government. His job in the propaganda mill was to alter history so that the people would learn only the history that the government wanted them to know. And if there was something in history which was inconvenient to the government, that all evidence of that historical event or person were eliminated as if the event had never happened and as if that person had never lived. And that's the way it would seem forever, oblivion. And so what happened was that he came across an article in a newspaper. Winston Smith came across an article in a newspaper which depicted what was then considered one of the great traitors to society, such as like a Benedict Arnold or something like that, and Emanuel Goldstein, that was a hero at one time of the country, I think Oceania, whatever country it was that in which Winston Smith lived in, the country where Big Brother controlled. And one of the great traitors that everyone was taught was a great traitor was Emanuel Goldstein. But then Winston Smith runs across a newspaper ad, which he of course destroys, that shows this Goldstein receiving a great award as a patriot from the government of Oceania, from Big Brother. And so, of course, when you see them, well, how is it? So Winston Smith thinks, oh, wait a second. If Emanuel Goldstein is such a traitor to the country, why did he ever receive this award? Now, when you live a lie, you don't know you're living a lie. You live because you believe it because you believe it, and you don't give it a second thought. Much the same way that we all agree that the world is round. We don't really give it a thought. If asked to prove it, I think most of us would have difficulty in proving the world is round, but we believe it because that is what we're taught, and all that we know is what we are taught. But when you have been told something that you believe to be true and then find out that maybe it was not true, that puts a little crack in the armor. Because if something that you have been told all your life is true, only to find out that it is not true, then what else have you been told that you believe is true that turns out not to be true? And so Winston Smith came to the realization that maybe what he was being told by the omnipresent Big Brother, the benevolent Big Brother, was maybe all a pack of lies, and that maybe their whole society was living a pack of lies in order to benefit a small group of gangsters at the helm. Now, in the book 1984, there's a lot of terminology which we use today, which came out of that book. Big Brother is one. The original the Big Brother came from that book. Every time you hear about Big Brother, and Big Brother stands for some controlling entity over your life that's always observing you and looking at you and keeping an eye on you so you don't do anything nasty, at least to them. That's Big Brother. Newspeak, doublespeak where you have contradictory terms, black-white. You say black-white so that if the government says, if you're looking at black and the government says it's white, it's white. And if you're looking at white and the government says it's black, then it's black. And you actually believe that. You actually believe that. You're not just going along because the government tells you to go along for a temporary rationale, but you actually believe it, and you look at black, and the government tells you that black is white, you then believe in your heart and your soul, in your mind, that it is white. And so that is what that society had reverted to. So you have this newspeak, doublespeak, and then you have these ministries. You have the ministries, the love ministry, which was preached hate. You have the ministry of plenty, which impoverished the people. And you had the ministry of justice, which, of course, was unjust. Now, you look at our society, we have the Department of Energy, which makes sure there's not enough energy. You have the Department of Justice, which hands over children to Castro and communist countries. You have all these other agencies. You have the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission, which makes sure that there's that unemployment increases. I mean, so you have all of these agencies in the United. You have the Housing and Urban Development, which makes sure that slums are created. And so in the United States, you have exactly the same thing. You have this entity, these agencies, which create the opposite of what they are titled to be. And so this is the book 1984 that you ought to read. So in it, of course, what happens is that Winston Smith is betrayed by a supposed friend, much as libertarians have been betrayed by Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and all the rest, because Winston Smith trusted this individual when actually this individual that seemed on the surface to be sympathetic was actually working for the other side, just like Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, and Mark Stein do. Much to our surprise, much to my surprise, but it's better to know the truth, I suppose, than to continue living the lie. And then it goes on that Winston Smith is tortured in a psychological way, a very interesting psychological way, in which he basically comes to love Big Brother. He betrays his true friend. He betrays his friend, who, of course, also had already betrayed him. And the function of government at that time was to make everybody isolated, to make sure there were no connections, to make sure there was no bonding between people, and to keep everybody isolated. Though there were no families at that time, and everyone and children turned in their parents, and their allegiance was to Big Brother, not to their parents. And are we any different today? Over 50% of children born in the United States today are born out of wedlock. They do not have a family. Who do they owe their allegiance to? Barack Obama and the government. It is what the government wants to create. That's what the government wants. It wants to be God. That is why the government attacks religion. That is why the government is pro-abortion. That is why the government has a system of public education to indoctrinate the children. That is why we create welfare programs and food stamps and all the rest for the increased dependency upon the government. That is why the government creates a system to destroy the family. Because then if they destroy your religion and remove religion from your life, if they destroy your family because you have no family because everybody's born out of wedlock, then what tethers you to anything other than the government? What is it where are your allies? Who can you trust? You have no family. You have no spiritual belief. You're dependent upon the government for your money, your food, your housing, your clothing, your transportation. You're educated by the government. You're indoctrinated by the government. If you want something, you turn to the government. You are no longer allowed to reach an agreement among yourselves, between yourselves. You look to the government and the lawyers and the legal system. They're the ones who are going to decide the relationship between people. Whenever there's an issue, you go to the government. The government's going to decide the course of action to take. No one can be trusted. You can't trust. Is that not what Homeland Security is now? Have you not seen the campaign? If you see something suspicious, make sure you tell the local authorities. So what's suspicious? If your friend supports UT instead of A&M, maybe that makes him suspicious. Maybe your neighbor is not really an anti-government person, but maybe your neighbor, it competes with you in business. So maybe if you can create a little lie, have the government go investigate him so that he has to spend money on defending himself, maybe that gives you a leg up in your business. So, maybe something like that comes across your mind. So maybe something that he does, which maybe is okay, but maybe looks a little suspicious. Maybe he went to a pro-life conference. Well, that's a little suspicious. Maybe he went to a libertarian meeting. Well, that makes him a little suspicious. You know what? That guy goes to the firing range every weekend and shoots a firearm. Well, that makes him a little suspicious, don't you think? Maybe he's a closet terrorist. And so now all of a sudden your one neighbor turns in another neighbor, so no one can trust anyone else. So who can you trust? Well, you can always trust the government. But can you always trust the government? What entity promotes genocide, mass murder, and war? It's the government. Only the government can do things like that. And so in 1984, that is what has happened, that no one can trust anyone else. Is that not the way communism is bred? Is it not the way Islam is bred? Is it not the way the Nazis? Did not the children of communists turn on their parents? Did not the children of Nazis turn on their parents? Don't the children of Islamists turn in their parents? Don't parents kill their own children if they deviate from the Islamist point of view? Who's the highest authority? Who's in charge? Who do you listen to? You don't listen to your parents. You don't have parents. You don't listen. The parents don't care about their children because their allegiance is to the government. The parents don't care about their children because their allegiance is to the government and not the family. Isn't that what our government is promoting through our system of public education, through Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security? Isn't that what our government wants? That we are dependent upon government and our allegiance is to government. And they do it, and it increases from second to second, minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, year to year, where we become more dependent upon government. We become more indoctrinated by government. Government is evil, and our government is as evil as any other government. The people in government think they are superior to the average person and wish to impose their will upon the people and the citizens of a country, not to the benefit of the citizen, not to the benefit of the country, but to the benefit of the government. If the government were wanted, why does the government have an army? If the government were wanted, why does the government have all of these regulations to steal from you and to take from you and give them the power and the authority to incarcerate you, to kill you, if they're such a benevolent organization? There are those who live in a society who benefit from a corrupt and authoritarian government. Were there not rich people in the darkest ages of the Soviet Union? Are there not rich people in communist China? Are there not rich people in communist Cuba? Aren't there rich people in Kenya, Uganda, and in Zimbabwe, where the majority of the people live in abject poverty? So just because there are people of wealth in a society doesn't mean that that society is good. When wealth is derived from government, the monies that government gets, they steal from the producers in a society. Government is not interested in productivity. Government is interested in power. Government is not interested in human rights. Government is interested in the authority and the power of government. The only reason governments exist, apparently, is to protect us from other governments, because there is absolutely no reason for our government to exist today other than to protect us from other governments. And so therefore we create these systems where we are protected by our government from the enemies that our government has created. So when we go to the airport, we have to get x-rays and patted down and treated as if we are guilty. We are presumed guilty and then have to prove our innocence. 7th and KRB Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. Be back after the short commercial break. Seventh KRB Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. We're back. Home of the Iron Microphone. The book 1984. Read it. It's very frightening. Scare you. It scared me. Still does. And what I find most disconcerting is how much more like the horrific world of 1984 we are now living in. The United States government is not benevolent. It's not interested in the Constitution. It is not interested in the founding of the nation. We need to, you have to be able to recognize the lie. You can't recognize something as a lie, then you're always going to be fooled throughout your life. Only Ron Paul speaks the truth. He's the only one addresses issues. He's the only one that adheres to constitutional principles. And one of the reasons that he is considered on the fringe is that it is because not that the constitutional principles have changed, not that his principles have changed, but that the nation has veered so far off the path of constitutional propriety, so far off the path of adhering to the ideology of our founding fathers, so far off the path of what this country was meant to be, that it is not Ron Paul that has left the path. He remains on the path. The country has left the path. The behavior of Barack Obama in his condescension towards Congress, in his authoritarian behavior, to me is almost unbelievable. But what is even more unbelievable is the tepid non-response of the Congress. The Congress should immediately defund the executive branch and force Barack Obama to remove those appointees. But they don't have what it takes, because to do that would require a principled stance. And politicians that are principled is rarity, and politician and principle are really a contradiction in terms, unfortunately. We once had a government of Madisons and Jeffersons and Franklins and Adams, but now we have a government of Clintons, of Bushes, and Obamas. And much to our loss, much to our chagrin, much to our depredations. And so one can hope that there are still enough freedom-loving individuals in this country who believe in the Constitution and the founding of the nation that Ron Paul can still and hopefully will come through at least with enough votes, delegates, to have a say as to what happens in the election. This is 7th and KRV Talkback with Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Rush Limbaugh in the toilet with all the rest. Back next week.